you put a part of yourself out into the world via the work you make. And if loads of people thought it was rubbish, that could be leave you feeling quite hurt or quite, exposed. But also, I think as I've got older, I've kind of cared a bit less about that as well. And in a way, that's part of the sort of flow of just trying things.
I'm really grateful today to have the opportunity to speak with Mark Murphy, who is a collage artist that I did discover on Instagram and now follow very assiduously because I enjoy his work very much. Thank you so much for making time today, Mark.
Thank you, Sarah, for inviting me to talk to you and your kind words about my art. Thank you.
Maybe we can start just by having you talk a little bit about how you became a collage artist.
So I guess I first started making collage as a teenager for posters for my band in kind of end of secondary school. It was kind of before computers had completely revolutionized desktop publishing. So it was kind of letter set, photocopies of images, things like that. Then I went to art school. And kind of Photoshop started to appear on computers. And I really see that as, that's a collaging tool in a lot of ways. It's sort of like for photo montage. And as it was something new and exciting, I kind of just pursued that for a lot of years. Since the time at art school, I've worked as a graphic designer. So the kind of reconnection with collage, the work that I make these days kind of came about probably about 10 years ago. I went to an event that was billed as a collage party. It was music, lots of secondhand books around, and lots of people just chatting and cutting stuff out and making stuff with their hands. Digital tools can be they can kind of be a bit endless because you can save multiple versions of things. You can scale things to the exact size you need them. You can flip things, you can change the color of things, you can rub things out. And I got quite good at using those digital tools, and something about going back to the simplicity of papers, found images, scissors and a cutting board and a scalpel. It kind of brought constraints that was kind of, I just found really stimulating creatively, perhaps. So you sort of like, I guess a lot of graphic design is kind of problem solving. So in a way, by limiting the parameters of the work I was making by working in an analog way, forced me to solve different problems, which I really enjoyed. And I think it was also a way to kind of separate out work that I was making in a more self-directed way from my kind of work as a designer for clients.
I actually realize I have to go back to the beginning. I lied when I said I discovered you on Instagram. It's actually not true. You just reminded me that thanks to COVID, one of your workshops that probably would have been live in collage making was put online and made it available to anybody. So I did it, and I was just really taken with your work and the idea of creating with physical pieces of paper and as X-Acto knives and rulers and the, like you said, the constraints around that, where on a computer you can just create what you need when you need it. But there's that element of design, I think, like you said, which is wonderful things emerge from some constraint. Total freedom doesn't necessarily create the best work for you.
Yeah, no, that's it. And it can kind of almost, it can almost be so, if something's so expansive, it can actually stop you from committing to something as well.
So music inspired you to begin working with collage. And what are some of your inspirations now as you do your work?
Still music, to be honest. I still make music, and I'm a huge music listener, consumer. I think in terms of like approaches, it can be anything from design I see to artworks, films, television. And then in terms of subject matter, that varies, but I often find that I kind of allow myself to just get absorbed in making without setting out with a huge plan and just seeing how things present themselves. So sort of allowing chance and serendipity to come into play, sort of constantly absorbing stuff. And also, listening to a lot of music. I think I'm always soaking in influences and ideas. Yeah.
So you do graphic design work for clients as well as the collage work for yourself. How do you balance, or how do you see the distinctions between those two types of, they're different forms of work, but also one is for clients as one is more for yourself?
Reconnecting with collage as a vehicle for my own creative output visually. It became a place of play, really, and sort of experimentation, and it didn't have the same time constraints or budgetary constraints. So it kind of, it opened up, not a new creative space, but perhaps reconnected me with a creative space that, just felt exciting in a way without constraints. And it's kind of, that's not to say that the design work I make doesn't excite me. It really does, but it kind of, it's someone else's brief, whereas my own work is my own work.
Can you describe a recent piece where you felt particularly excited?
Since 2019, I've been exploring projection and showing my work at scale, using light. So it's kind of like temporary murals, I guess. I made a series of work in the autumn last year called Remember the Future. A lot of the materials that I use are kind of what you might call vintage, bits of printed ephemera and magazines, books, things like that. I was kind of interested to see what did people think the future was going to look like, and how does that relate to where we are now, because we're in their future. And it's kind of like, so it's kind of, I made a series of 11 works that were projected on a loop at scale. They were like 13 meters by 7 meters, so they were huge. That was really exciting, seeing that, and seeing, I think one of the nice things with making work in that way is you, in a festival context, you get to sort of experience an audience's reaction, which is not what you do. I mean, someone can like something on Instagram, but you don't know if they're going to talk to their friends about it or point at that bit and say, wow, what's happening in that bit?
Did you ever question, as you went from playing music as a young fellow and creating the collage work and deciding to go to art school, becoming a graphic designer, did you ever question your choice of profession along the way and wonder whether you should become an artist?
It's weird because I've only felt comfortable calling myself an artist in about the last 5 years, if I'm honest.
Why
it's a tag that, like, well, I could quite happily call myself, I'm a designer, but I kind of was like, you're an artist? Well, what do you do? Where will I have seen your work? And I couldn't answer those questions previously. So it's been a gradual thing to kind of settle into that as a descriptor of self, I suppose. In terms of the artistic work, any monetization of that has only really been recent,
When you say now you're comfortable thinking of yourself as an artist, what does that mean to you?
I guess because I've made lots of visual work for myself on my own terms. If I said to someone that I'm a visual artist, they'd say, "Oh, can I see some of your work?" And I'll say, "Yes, here it is." So perhaps before you've got that catalogue of work, that's perhaps when I was kind of, when the opportunities to make artworks previously had been a bit more sporadic. So I might do a project 1 year and then nothing for 2 years and then something else. And then there's life things happening and then years pass. So, I mean, my friends all laugh because they go, "You've always been an artist." Do you know what I mean? But it's sort of like, I can remember just sort of hearing myself describe myself as an artist to a guy in a shop. I was kind of like hunting for collage materials. And he was like, "Oh, you're a collector." And I said, "No, I'm an artist." And he went, "Oh." And I kind of came away and I said to Laura, my partner, I was like, "I should call myself an artist." And she went, "Well, you are." And I was like, "Well, I've never done that before." How you describe yourself versus how people perceive you isn't always in tally. I mean, at the first large-scale projection piece I did, it was part of a festival, and we got the opportunity to sort of get some mentorship from really quite established photographers and artists. And there's a Dutch artist called Eric Kessels, who I sort of presented some interim ideas to. And he just challenged me to get out of my comfort zone. And no one had really done that. Just mess it up, do something that makes you feel uncomfortable. So I was like, took a few weeks to let that settle in. And then sort of with support from the festival, kind of said, "Do you reckon I can project a 20-metre image on a canal side building that's going to reflect in the canal? So it's 40 metres. I've never done that before. I don't know what kit I need. I don't know where we'd put a generator. I don't know what soundtrack we'd have." But nudged by Eric, I kind of did sort of take the risk. And in a way, that was a really amazing experience to kind of take that step into the unknown. And then you succeed at that. And then it's like, right, what's the next step? Did a project in January with 6 projectors in a cathedral as part of a musical piece written by a brilliant musician called Nitin Sawhney. And it was housed in Coventry Cathedral. The original Coventry Cathedral was sort of destroyed in World War II from a bombing raid, and it was rebuilt in the 60s. And it's this, I think it opened in 1962, and it's absolutely stunning building. It's kind of modernist, I guess, but and I kind of was able to, I saw the space and I thought, well, this space is so huge. It's like 25 meters tall. And I've got this little battery powered projector that I brought along, and we sort of tried a few little images here and there. I went away from it and I was like, it needs a lot of light. We need to sort of really make an impact, because otherwise it'll just feel a bit lost in this massive space. And yeah, I've never worked with 6 projectors before, but now I've done that too. So you kind of like, yeah, in a way, once you sort of open yourself up to the idea that it is okay to fail. I think that's really interesting, because if you fail, you learn anyway. So you just keep moving forward.
What then would you describe as a failure that you've had that you've learned from?
Nothing too public.
Fair enough.
Yeah, I've been kind of lucky. I don't think I've had any big public failures. Yeah, I guess in terms of failure, I suppose, perhaps for a long time, the threat of failure actually was prohibitive in a way of creating. So whilst a failure that I've learned from, perhaps what I've actually learned from is that being afraid of failure stops you doing something. So it's not the failure itself, but it's still informed by failure. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
absolutely. I like that.
Yeah. So that kind of, that thing where you kind of look over your shoulder too much, or you're kind of, I can't do that. There's not enough time, or there's not enough budget, or blah, blah, blah. I think, I'm kind of like making work regularly, so it feels like there's a flow. And in terms of being open to trying things that I haven't done before. Keep trying, keep taking risks, I suppose.
I'm also curious about the interaction between the images and the music when you create those projections. So how much of the work, the visual work you create, is informed or affected by the music?
I've done 2 large-scale projections, single projector, and more recently for Ghosts in the Ruins, the 6 projectors in the cathedral. The first piece, there was a friend who makes really amazing kind of ambient soundscapes, Chris Herbert, and I'd been thinking about the location of this first projection piece was a canal side, a sort of dilapidated Victorian building that had been a malting house to malt hops for the production of beer. But it was like, I mean, they made good buildings in them days. So it was kind of like, it's this really awesome building that was right on the canal. And the first day I saw it, the canal was still. So it just like doubled its height with this kind of mirrored reflection. I just thought it was a really interesting, amazing space. And going there a few times on the sort of recce's for the project, I think on one occasion I had my headphones in and I was like, oh, a bit of sound would be good as well, because it kind of will add to a sense of occasion. And I just, in that first instance, I asked Chris if I could use his music, and he said, yeah, of course, you can play it. So we got a PA speaker, and it was just kind of like people were led to the site by me. And when we got there, we'd been talking on the way. And when we got there, I was like, I'm just going to let you look at the images now. And then the soundtrack began. And it just sort of settled people into the moment. So then more recently in autumn last year, the Remember the Future piece, I made my own soundtrack for that, but I made the images first. But I was kind of like, it was sort of exploring sounds that were kind of like, what did in the 60s, what did people think the 2000s would sound like, and it's kind of sort of like synthy sounds and stuff like that. But again, learning from Chris in the way, because it was kind of like, there's like very sort of subtle hints at rhythm, but it's more kind of texture. So, but then the piece more recently was working with a musician of amazingly high caliber. You know, Nitin is like Ivor Novello lifetime achievement. You know, he's kind of like performed at the Royal Albert Hall, and the work that I made, which was kind of curated archive, perhaps more than kind of straight up collage. I was allowing the sort of juxtapositions in the space to be the collage rather than chopping the images apart themselves. That was to work specifically with 3 soundscapes that Nitin had written. So each has been quite different. And I think the first 2, the music came second. And this more recent one, I'd started to research the archive, but I started to pull together the flow of it to work with the sound, because it was that the core of the piece was the musical element, I think, and the visuals were to sort of add to part of it.
I find that really interesting, just the interaction between different media in a way. So how visual informs sound and how sound informs visual. And this is really obscure, but I was listening to a radio program last night where somebody had taken the frequencies that are emitted by color and translated them into sound by dividing them by 240 times or something technical, like some physical calculation. And so he played the color green.
Wow.
And then
how did it sound?
Synthy and cool, actually, really synthy and cool. And then he said, in Canada, for example, the leaves change color. So in the fall, they go from green to yellow to orange to red. And it's because their frequencies are slowing down because they're dying. And so there's the sound for green is a higher frequency, and then yellow, and then orange, and then red. It was just, I thought it was a really beautiful, just making that, it's from physics, but like this connection between what we see visually and what we hear. And anyway, it's a little bit weird.
No, that's amazing. Yeah, but it's kind of like I did design for a project for some artists that had been artists in residence at CERN, the
Switzerland,
Large Hadron Collider, and the piece was called Halo, and the artist is called Semiconductor. They make really amazing work, but they'd kind of built a huge kind of structure with strings that were like bass strings, and there was loads of pickups and loads of little hammers, but the hammers were controlled by data that they'd gathered from CERN, like a tiny little bit of the maths that record, the mathematical record of the Big Bang. It wasn't tuneful, but it was kind of like, the sort of randomness of it was really interesting. Yeah. Audio collage is something that I'll perhaps play with a bit in the future, gathering found sound. I often use, while we're talking about sound and collage, there's a record called Introducing by DJ Shadow, released in about 96, I think. But it's sample based kind of hip hop, trip hop, but every sound on it is a found sample. So his artistry is the cut and paste basically, and it's a masterpiece of a record. And like literally every bass note, every snare sound, everything existed in another form, and he kind of gathered, spliced, compiled. Yeah, I kind of like that. I think I just began to think about the hunt and going to look for material as a collage artist in similar terms. Someone that goes digging in record stores, I'd be kind of digging in charity bookshops, and sometimes you don't know why that's the book you need to leave the store with. but you just know that there's something in it. You don't know where it's going to end up, but it's caught your eye, and yeah, just follow that instinct and just go with it. You carry a smartphone around and you've got a decent recorder in your pocket at all times. So sometimes I will, if I'm going through London and the tube sounds particularly screechy or something, you might just grab a bit of that. I don't know when I'll use it, may never, but kind of that kind of collector mindset of just gathering for something or other.
I never knew anything about collage, really. I mean, I looked at David Carson, I follow, and he has a very different style of collage that you do.
David Carson, interesting you say David Carson. He was a huge influence. Like when he came to talk to us in Bristol in probably 1992. And I would say, I've met him a few times now, but sort of say that he kind of introduced a way of thinking about, a way of seeing, I suppose. He'd sort of, because he was not a schooled graphic designer, but by not knowing the rules, he broke all the rules and in turn invented a whole new set of rules in some ways. Well, it was Reagan, really, that was a music magazine, and he just he threw convention completely out the window, and it's just kind of, but he was showing us just photographs that he took. And this was in the 90s, and it would be like a no parking sign, someone painting no parking on their fence. And all the letters were lowercase except the R in parking. And it was kind of like, that's just because the way the person painted it. But then he'd sort of like translate that found sort of environmental things that he'd notice and kind of play with that as typography, which is really interesting. It kind of, yeah. And then, so yeah, those ways of seeing, I think for me and a bunch of my kind of peers, that really did sort of change the way we looked at the world.
Interesting. I was struck by what you said just before about ways of seeing. It just started me thinking about what we were talking about before, about what it means to be an artist and how much that may have to do with either discovering new ways of seeing or sharing new ways of seeing or being open to different ways of seeing. And it doesn't have to be visual seeing. It's just new ways of seeing.
No, yeah, definitely taking a different viewpoint. Every artist has a different way of seeing, I guess. Every person does. I think when you remind people to kind of, look up, walk down the street, but look up today, or, sit on the grass rather than on the bench. The world looks different from there. It's kind of like little things you can adjust the viewpoint, but that can be really healthy as well.
Yeah, just that capital R in the no parking sign. He noticed it, and how many people walked by and didn't notice or didn't register, but he noticed it, and he didn't just notice it, but he used that as an impetus to create a different kind of, and his stuff is edgy and cool, and he rips things up, and that goes with his style, and somebody else is going to see something different.
Definitely. It's like a constant exploration of composition, because once if you flatten the world to a photograph, it's 3D space, and it kind of becomes a 2D thing. It has to have an edge. Just letting a picture, you don't need to say anything about it. Here's just a picture of an eroded letter F on a fire hydrant. Why do you like it? I just like it.
I want to thank you so much for making the time to speak with me today. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, good. I really enjoyed it too.